a lonely mountain man found an obese teen tied to his fence, with "Too fat to marry" painted across her Sunday dress. The wind howled through the pines as he cut the ropes, her wrists raw, her eyes full of shame. But this was no cruel prank. This was a warning. Behind the paint was a secret her enemies would do anything to bury. A secret worth more than gold, and dangerous enough to set the whole town against them. From the church bell's toll to the judge's gavel, every step toward justice would draw gunmen, whispers, and old grudges out of the shadows. And in a land where a woman's worth was too often measured by her waistline, and a man's by the land he held, the fight for her dignity would become a battle for truth itself. What will happen when the one place she thought might save her becomes the place that could destroy her? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. On a late autumn afternoon, Jedediah Cross guided his mule down the winding trail from his trapline above Willow Fork. The beast's back was laden with sacks of flour, beans, and lamp oil, supplies to see him through the coming winter months. As he neared his cabin, a thin wisp of smoke from the chimney promised a quiet evening ahead. Jed's weathered face creased into a slight smile. After weeks in the high country, the thought of a warm hearth and a hot meal was mighty welcome. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the crisp scent of fallen leaves and the first hint of frost. But then, carried on that same breeze, came a sound that made Jed pull up short. A faint sob, barely audible over the rustling branches. He cocked his head, listening. There it was again, a sound of pain that didn't belong to any critter he knew. "Whoa there," he murmured to his mule, patting its neck. "Best we check this out." Jed dismounted, his boots crunching on the carpet of pine needles. He led the mule closer to home, his eyes scanning the shadows. As he neared his fence line, the sobbing grew clearer. Then he saw her. A young woman was slumped against one of the fence posts, her wrists bound with rough rope. Even from a distance, Jed could see her Sunday dress was a mess, smeared with something dark and sticky. His heart clenched as he recognized her face. "Pearl?" he called softly, approaching with care. "Pearl Johnson? That you?" The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. Jed's breath caught as he saw her face clearly. Pearl's cheeks were streaked with tears, her skin reddened by the biting wind. But what made his blood run cold were the cruel words painted across her dress in black tar. "Too fat to marry." "Oh, child," Jed breathed, anger and sorrow warring in his chest. He hurried forward, pulling his hunting knife from his belt. "Let's get you loose." Pearl flinched as he approached but didn't struggle as he carefully cut through the ropes. Her wrists were raw where the bindings had chafed. "There now," Jed said gently, sheathing his knife. He shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it over Pearl's shoulders. "Can you stand?" Pearl nodded weakly, but her legs buckled as she tried to rise. Without hesitation, Jed scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. She was a big girl, sturdy built like her mama had been, but Jed's years in the mountains had left him strong. "Let's get you inside where it's warm," he said, carrying her towards the cabin. The mule followed, bells jingling softly. Inside, Jed eased Pearl onto a chair by the fireplace. He stoked the embers, adding kindling until flames licked hungrily at the dry wood. Next, he filled a kettle and hung it over the fire to heat. "You just sit tight," he told Pearl, his voice gruff but kind. "I'll fetch some clean water and rags. We'll get you cleaned up proper." As he worked, Jed's mind raced. Who could have done such a thing? Pearl was barely more than a child, for heaven's sake. He'd known her since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, back when her mama still did laundry for the miners. A quiet girl, always with her nose in a book when chores were done. When he returned with a basin of warm water and some soft cloths, Pearl had stopped shaking. She sat hunched in the chair, Jed's coat pulled tight around her. "Here now," Jed said, setting the basin down. "Let's see about getting that mess off you." As he gently dabbed at the tar on Pearl's dress, he asked softly, "Can you tell me what happened, child? How'd you come to be out here like this?" Pearl's lower lip trembled, but she took a deep breath. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It was Jimmy Hawkins. He told me he liked me. Said he wanted to take me on a picnic. She ducked her head, shame coloring her cheeks. I should have known better. Should have known a white boy wouldn't really... She trailed off, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. Jed's heart ached for her. Go on, he encouraged softly. Pearl sniffled. When we got to the creek, his friends were waiting. They laughed and called me names. Said Jimmy only asked me out 'cause he lost a bet. Her voice broke. They held me down, poured that tar on my dress, tied me up and left me out there. Jed's hand tightened on the cloth he held, fury building in his chest. Those low-down, yellow-bellied... He bit off the curse, taking a steadying breath. I'm sorry that happened to you, Pearl. Ain't right, not by any measure. Pearl nodded, wiping at her eyes. I tried to get loose, but the ropes were too tight. Couldn't do nothing but walk, and I was scared to go back to town looking like this. So I just kept walking. You did right coming this way, Jed assured her. Ain't no one gonna hurt you here. As he worked to clean away the tar, the kettle began to whistle. Jed poured hot water into a mug, adding a pinch of dried peppermint leaves. Here, he said, pressing the steaming cup into Pearl's hands. This'll warm you up inside. Pearl took a cautious sip, then another. Some color began to return to her cheeks. Thank you, Mr. Cross, she murmured. Jed nodded, then glanced out the window. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Long shadows stretched across the yard, and in the fading light, he could still make out those cruel words glistening on Pearl's discarded dress. He turned back to Pearl, his expression solemn. Now, you listen here. You ain't sleeping out in the cold tonight, that's for certain. We'll get you fixed up proper, then figure out what's to be done. Pearl's eyes widened. But what about my aunt? She'll be worried sick. Jed stroked his chin thoughtfully. Reckon you're right about that. Tell you what, soon as we get you settled, I'll ride into town and let her know you're safe. That sound all right? Pearl nodded gratefully. Yes, sir. Thank you. As the fire crackled merrily in the hearth, Jed felt a fierce protectiveness well up inside him. He might be just a simple trapper, a man more at home in the wilderness than in town, but he knew right from wrong, and what had been done to this girl was as wrong as it got. You rest easy now, he told Pearl, his voice gentle but firm. Ain't no one gonna harm you here. You have my word on that. Jedediah Cross stirred the pot of stew simmering over the fire, the savory aroma filling his small cabin. He glanced over at Pearl, who sat huddled in his oversized coat, her eyes distant and troubled. The girl had been through hell, and Jed's heart ached for her. Reckon this is about ready, he said, ladling the thick mixture into a wooden bowl. Come on over here, child. You need to get some hot food in you. Pearl rose stiffly, wincing as she moved. Jed guided her gently to a chair by the hearth, setting the steaming bowl on a small table beside her. He handed her a spoon, then knelt to examine her wrists. Let's see about cleaning these up, he murmured, reaching for a clean cloth and the basin of warm water. As he began to carefully dab at the angry red marks left by the ropes, Pearl took a tentative sip of the stew. This is real good, Mr. Cross, she said softly. Thank you. Jed nodded, focusing on his task. You're welcome. Now, if you feel up to it, can you tell me a bit more about what happened? Where do you live in town? Pearl swallowed another spoonful before answering. I stay with my aunt just off Main Street. Been there since... She trailed off, a flicker of old pain crossing her face. Since Mama passed. I remember, Jed said gently. Your mama was a fine woman. Did laundry for half the miners in these parts, as I recall. Pearl nodded. Aunt Bess and I still run the laundry. It's how we get by. Jed's hands stilled for a moment. And this boy who tricked you, you know him. Pearl's shoulders hunched, shame coloring her cheeks. Clay Henson, she whispered. He came by the laundry last week, said he admired how hard I worked, asked if I'd like to take a walk with him today. She shook her head. I should have known better. A rich white boy like that wouldn't really be interested in someone like me. Jed's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. What happened then? He led me out past the edge of town, Pearl continued, her voice barely audible. Said he knew a nice spot for a picnic, but when we got there, she trailed off, a shudder running through her. His friends were waiting, Jed finished grimly. Pearl nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. They laughed, called me names, said Clay only asked me out 'cause he lost a bet. Her voice broke. Then they held me down and... Shh, it's all right, Jed soothed, patting her hand gently. You don't need to say more. I understand. They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional sniffle from Pearl. Jed finished cleaning her wrists, then stood, his expression determined. You stay here and finish that stew, he said. I need to ride into town, let your aunt know you're safe, and have a word with some folks. Pearl looked up, alarm in her eyes. But don't you worry, Jed assured her. I'll be back before you know it. Old Blue here will keep you company. He gestured to the grizzled hound dozing by the fire. Just bolt the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone but me. You hear? Pearl nodded reluctantly. Jed gathered his hat and coat, then paused at the door. You're safe here, Pearl. I promise you that. With those words, he stepped out into the gathering twilight. Pearl followed him to the door, sliding the heavy wooden bolt into place after he'd gone. Through the small window, she watched as Jed saddled his horse and rode off down the trail towards town. The 5-mile ride into Willow Fork seemed to pass in the blink of an eye for Jed. His mind churned with anger and worry, spurring his horse to a faster pace. As he approached the outskirts of town, he could see lamps burning in the windows of the saloon and general store. A few townsfolk still milled about on the boardwalks, but most had headed home for the evening. Jed didn't slow his mount as he passed through the center of town. He had one destination in mind, the Henson spread. Thomas Henson was one of the most powerful men in the county, owning vast tracts of land and hundreds of head of cattle. His son Clay had always been a troublemaker, but this was beyond the pale. As Jed approached the Henson property, he spotted Thomas near the main gate, tools in hand as he worked on a repair. The older man looked up at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, his brow furrowing as he recognized Jed. Cross? Thomas called out. What brings you down from your mountain at this hour? Jed reined in his horse, dismounting in one fluid motion. His expression was grim as he approached Thomas. We need to talk, Henson. It's about your boy. Thomas's face darkened. What's Clay done now? In clipped tones, Jed relayed what had happened to Pearl Johnson. With each word, Thomas's expression grew stormier. By the time Jed finished, the rancher's hands were clenched into tight fists. You're certain about this? Thomas asked, his voice low and dangerous. Jed nodded. Saw the girl myself. She's up at my cabin now, too scared to come back to town. Thomas swore under his breath. I'll tan that boy's hide myself. This kind of behavior, it's unacceptable. He turned to Jed, his eyes hard. Where is he now? Last I heard, he and his friends were heading to the saloon to celebrate their joke. Jed spat the last word. Without another word, Thomas strode to the barn, emerging moments later astride his own horse. Let's go, he said grimly. I want to hear this from Clay's own mouth. The two men rode back towards town side by side, an unlikely pair united in their quest for justice. As they approached the saloon, raucous laughter spilled out onto the street. Jed's jaw tightened, recognizing Clay's voice among the din. Thomas dismounted first, his spurs jangling as he strode towards the saloon doors. Jed followed close behind, keenly aware of the power dynamics at play. Thomas Henson might be Clay's father, but he was also a man of influence in these parts. His word carried weight. As they pushed through the swinging doors, the laughter inside faltered. Clay Henson sat at a table near the back, surrounded by his friends. The young man's face paled as he saw his father's thunderous expression. Pa? Clay stammered, rising unsteadily to his feet. What are you doing here? Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the other patrons in the saloon. Clear out, he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. Now. There was a scraping of chairs and a flurry of movement as people hurried to obey. Within moments, only Clay, his friends, Thomas, and Jed remained. Thomas fixed his son with a steely glare. I want to hear exactly what happened with Pearl Johnson today, he said, his voice dangerously calm. And so help me, boy, if you lie to me. Clay swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling in the face of his father's anger. As Jed watched, he knew that this moment could change everything, not just for Pearl, but for the entire town. Thomas Henson's reaction would set the tone for how such incidents were handled in the future. With a silent prayer, Jed prepared himself for whatever might come next. Justice, he hoped, would prevail. By the time Jed and Thomas Henson reached the main street of Willow Fork, lanterns hung from the hitch rails, casting a warm glow over the dusty boardwalks. The night air carried the faint sounds of piano music and laughter from the saloon, a stark contrast to the grim determination etched on both men's faces. As they approached, they spotted Clay and his friends lounging in front of the saloon, their raucous laughter echoing down the street. Clay, his blonde hair tousled and his shirt collar askew, was in the middle of regaling his companions with some tale that had them all in stitches. Thomas Henson's face darkened at the sight of his son's carefree demeanor. Without a word, he swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a thud that seemed to silence the entire street. Clay's laughter died in his throat as he caught sight of his father striding towards him, Jed Cross following close behind. "Pa?" Clay stammered, straightening up and trying to adopt a more sober expression. "What are you?" The crack of Thomas's hand across Clay's cheek cut off the young man's words. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden hush that fell over the group. "Home," Thomas growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Now." Clay's friends scattered like leaves in the wind, leaving the young man standing alone before his father. For a moment, Clay's eyes blazed with defiance, and he shot a venomous glare at Jed. But one look at his father's thunderous expression was enough to quell any thoughts of rebellion. Without another word, Clay turned and stumbled towards his horse, his cheek already reddening from the blow. Thomas watched him go, his jaw clenched tight, before turning to Jed. "I'll deal with this," he said gruffly. "You have my word." Jed nodded, a mixture of relief and wariness settling in his chest. Having someone of Thomas Henson's influence on their side was a powerful ally, but he knew the matter was far from settled. As Thomas mounted his horse and rode off after his son, Jed turned his own mount back towards his cabin. The ride home seemed longer in the dark, with only the stars and a sliver of moon to light his way. His mind churned with worry for Pearl and anger at the cruelty she'd endured. When he finally reached his cabin, a warm glow spilled from the windows, a beacon of safety in the night. Jed dismounted and took care of his horse before heading inside, his boots creaking on the porch boards. As he pushed open the door, he found Pearl dozing by the fire, her head resting on her arms at the table. The sight of her, safe and warm, eased some of the tension in Jed's shoulders. "Pearl?" he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She stirred, blinking up at him with sleep-heavy eyes. "Mr. Cross? You're back." Jed nodded, hanging up his hat and coat. "Everything's being handled," he assured her, keeping his voice gentle. "Thomas Henson knows what his boy did, and he's not happy about it." Relief washed over Pearl's face, and some of the rigid set of her shoulders seemed to ease. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No need for thanks," Jed replied, moving to stoke the fire. "It's what any decent person would do." As the flames crackled back to life, Jed pulled out a bedroll from a trunk near the wall. "You can sleep here by the hearth," he said, laying it out for her. "It'll be warm and you'll be safe." Pearl nodded gratefully, easing herself onto the bedroll with a wince. The events of the day had clearly taken their toll, both physically and emotionally. Before turning in himself, Jed made a show of checking the door latch twice, wanting to reassure Pearl of her safety. "Nobody's getting in here," he said firmly. "You rest easy now." As he settled into his own bed, Jed listened to the soft sounds of Pearl's breathing evening out as she drifted off to sleep. Outside, an owl hooted, and the wind whispered through the pines. Despite the peace of the night, Jed found sleep elusive, his mind turning over the events of the day and worrying about what the morning might bring. When dawn's first light began to creep through the windows, Jed rose quietly, careful not to wake Pearl. She was still curled up by the hearth, her face peaceful in sleep. Jed pulled on his boots and coat, deciding to get an early start on the day's chores. The crisp morning air nipped at his cheeks as he stepped out onto the porch. Frost glittered on the grass, and his breath puffed out in white clouds. Jed was just about to head for the woodpile when something caught his eye. There, on the porch steps, sat a brick. At first glance, it seemed innocuous enough, but as Jed bent to examine it, his blood ran cold. Wrapped around the brick was a piece of paper, held in place by a length of twine. With trembling fingers, Jed untied the string and unfolded the note. The message, scrawled in crude letters, made his stomach knot with dread. "Send her away or we'll finish what we started." Jed's first instinct was to crumple the note in his fist, but he forced himself to think clearly. This was evidence, proof that the danger to Pearl hadn't passed. Clay's humiliation at his father's hands had clearly stirred up more trouble. Glancing back at the cabin to ensure Pearl was still asleep, Jed made a quick decision. He tucked the note into his pocket and carried the brick around to the back of the cabin. There, he buried it deep in the woods, erasing any sign of its presence. Back inside, Jed stoked the fire in the stove and carefully fed the threatening note into the flames. He watched it curl and blacken, making sure every last scrap was reduced to ash before Pearl woke. As he set about preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee, Jed's mind raced. The note made it clear that Clay and his friends weren't done causing trouble. But how far would they go? And how could he keep Pearl safe without frightening her even more? The smell of coffee roused Pearl from her sleep. She sat up, rubbing her eyes and wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her sore muscles. "Morning," Jed said, trying to keep his voice light and casual. "Hope you're hungry. Breakfast is almost ready." Pearl managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Cross, for everything." As they sat down to their simple meal, Jed couldn't help but notice the way Pearl's eyes darted nervously to the windows every now and then. The events of yesterday were still fresh in her mind, and Jed felt a pang of guilt for not telling her about the note. But as he watched her slowly relax over the warm food and coffee, Jed knew he'd made the right choice. Pearl needed to feel safe, if only for a little while. He'd find a way to protect her, no matter what it took. The unease from the morning's discovery lingered through their quiet breakfast, hanging in the air like an unspoken threat. Jed knew that the peaceful moment couldn't last. Sooner or later, they'd have to face the harsh reality waiting for them beyond the cabin walls. But for now, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the day's warmth began to chase away the morning chill, Jed allowed himself a moment of hope. They had allies in town now, and he wasn't about to let anyone harm Pearl again. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Pearl watched Jed carefully as they finished their breakfast. His brow was furrowed, and he kept glancing towards the windows. She'd seen that look before, on her aunt's face when bills were due, on her mother's when she was ill. It was the look of someone carrying a heavy burden. "Mr. Cross," she said softly, setting down her empty cup. "What's troubling you? And don't tell me it's nothing. I can see it plain as day." Jed sighed, his shoulders sagging. He'd hoped to shield her from more worry, but Pearl was too perceptive. "I'm sorry, Pearl. I didn't want to frighten you, but—" He hesitated, then reached for the stove. Opening the door, he pointed to the ashes inside. There was a note, left on the porch this morning. Pearl's eyes widened. From Clay? Maybe. Or his friends. Jed's voice was grim. "It said to send you away, or they'd finish what they started. I burned it. Didn't want you to see." Pearl's hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "Thank you for telling me the truth." She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Mr. Cross, there's something I need to tell you too. Something that might explain why they're so set on causing trouble." Jed leaned forward, listening intently as Pearl spoke. "My mama, before she passed, she owned a piece of land. Good land with water rights." Pearl's eyes grew distant, remembering. "She always said it was my inheritance, that it would give me a future beyond scrubbing clothes in the laundry." Jed nodded slowly, beginning to see where this was going. "But after she died," Pearl continued, her voice catching, "the title to that land just vanished. And now, that same piece of property is part of the Henson Ranch." Jed's eyes widened in understanding. "So Clay's family might be worried you could try to reclaim it." Pearl nodded. "I never thought much about it before, but now with all this happening—" "It's not just about cruelty," Jed finished for her. "It's about land." The gravity of the situation settled over them both. This wasn't just a matter of a cruel prank gone too far. There were powerful interests at stake, the kind of interests that could drive men to desperate actions. Jed stood pacing the small cabin as he thought. "We need to keep you out of sight," he said finally. "At least until we can find some proof of your mama's claim. If there's a paper trail, it'll be in town records, maybe the land office." Pearl nodded, her face set with determination. "What should we do?" "I've got a line shack up in the high country," Jed explained. "I use it for trapping in the winter. It's rough, but it's safe. Nobody goes up there this time of year." As evening fell, Jed busied himself with preparations. He served a hearty supper of beans and salt pork, making sure Pearl ate her fill. Then, while she rested by the fire, he set about readying their defenses. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, Jed pulled out his hunting knife. The rhythmic sound of stone against steel filled the cabin as he carefully honed the blade to a razor's edge. Next, he turned his attention to his rifle, meticulously cleaning and oiling each part. As he worked, Jed's thoughts turned to his sidearm, a single-action Colt revolver. It was a reliable weapon, but slow to reload. In a pinch, those precious seconds could mean the difference between life and death. He made a mental note to keep the rifle close at hand once they reached the line shack. Pearl watched him work, her eyes solemn. "I'm sorry to bring all this trouble to your door, Mr. Cross." Jed shook his head firmly. "Don't you apologize, Pearl. None of this is your fault. And I aim to see you get justice for what happened yesterday and for your mama's land." As dawn broke the next morning, Jed and Pearl set out for the high country. Jed's pack mule was loaded down with supplies, food, blankets, extra ammunition. Pearl rode Jed's horse while he led the way on foot. The trail was steep and winding, climbing steadily into the mountains. The air grew thinner and cooler as they ascended, the trees changing from cottonwoods to pines. Pearl marveled at the wildflowers that still clung to life in the shadow of approaching winter. They stopped often to rest, Jed keeping a watchful eye on Pearl. She was still sore from her ordeal, and the altitude made breathing difficult. But she never complained, her determination evident in the set of her jaw and the straightness of her spine. As they climbed, Jed pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a bend in a creek. "In case we get separated," he explained, "though I pray it won't come to that." The sun was sinking towards the western peaks when they finally reached the line shack. It was a simple structure, little more than 4 walls and a roof, but to Pearl's weary eyes, it looked like a palace. Jed helped her down from the horse, then quickly set about unloading their supplies and tending to the animals. Pearl wanted to help, but her legs felt like jelly after the long ride. "You rest," Jed insisted gently. "I'll get us settled." By the time full darkness fell, Jed had a small fire crackling in the shack's crude fireplace. He lit a single oil lamp, keeping the flame low to avoid drawing attention. The warm glow barely reached the corners of the room, but it was enough to chase away the deepest shadows. Pearl sat wrapped in a blanket, sipping a cup of hot coffee. The events of the past 2 days seemed almost unreal up here, in the quiet of the mountains. But the ache in her muscles and the worry in Jed's eyes were constant reminders of the danger they faced. "Try to get some sleep," Jed said softly, arranging some bedrolls near the fire. "I'll keep watch for a while." As Pearl settled onto her makeshift bed, she couldn't help but wonder what the coming days would bring. The thought of her mother's land, stolen away after her death, filled her with a mix of sorrow and determination. Whatever happened, she knew she couldn't let that injustice stand. Jed sat by the door, his rifle across his knees, listening to the night sounds of the forest. He knew the real fight was yet to come, but for now, in this moment, Pearl was safe. It was a small victory, but one he would hold on to with both hands. The days in the line shack passed slowly, each one blending into the next. For Pearl, it was a stark change from the bustle of town life, but she found an unexpected peace in the quiet of the mountains. The small cabin, with its rough-hewn logs and single room, became a sanctuary of sorts. Jed, ever watchful, took it upon himself to teach Pearl the skills she'd need to survive in this harsh environment. On their second morning, he guided her outside to gather kindling. "Watch closely now," he instructed, kneeling by the fireplace. Pearl sat beside him, her eyes fixed on his hands as he arranged the wood. You want to start small, with the driest twigs you can find. He demonstrated how to build the fire, layering larger pieces as the flames grew. Pearl nodded, absorbing every detail. When it came time to try herself, her first attempt sputtered out quickly, but Jed's encouragement never wavered. That's all right, he said gently. Takes practice, try again. By her third attempt, Pearl had a small fire crackling merrily in the hearth. The pride in her eyes was unmistakable. As the days wore on, Jed continued his lessons. He showed Pearl how to mend a tear in his old wool coat, guiding her hands as she threaded the needle. Her fingers, accustomed to the rough work of the laundry, proved deft with the delicate task. My mama taught me some, Pearl explained as she worked, but we never had much to practice on. Jed nodded, understanding. You're a natural, he said, and Pearl's smile lit up the dim cabin. On the third day, Jed took Pearl outside to teach her how to set a simple snare. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and approaching winter. As they worked, Pearl noticed a fine dusting of white on the distant ridges. Snow, Jed confirmed, following her gaze. Comes early up here. We'll need to be prepared. Pearl nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully bent the wire into shape. Jed watched, impressed by how quickly she grasped the technique. You're a quick study, he remarked. Pearl straightened, a hint of pride in her voice. I've always been good at remembering things. Comes in handy at the laundry, keeping track of everyone's orders. As they walked back to the cabin, Pearl's steps seemed lighter, more confident. The skills she was learning, though simple, were giving her a sense of capability she'd never known before. That afternoon, Jed announced he needed to make a supply run into town. We're running low on flour and coffee, he explained, and I need to see if I can learn anything about what's happening down there. Pearl nodded, trying to hide her nervousness. Be careful, she said softly. Jed squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. I will. Bolt the door behind me and don't open it for anyone but me. Remember our signal? Pearl nodded again, recalling the distinctive pattern of knocks they'd agreed upon. As Jed rode down the mountain, the familiar sights of Willow Fork came into view. He took care to approach from an unexpected direction, tying his horse in a secluded spot before making his way to the mercantile. Inside the store, Jed kept his head down, gathering supplies while straining his ears to catch any useful gossip. It didn't take long before he overheard two men talking in low voices near the back of the shop. That Johnson girl, one was saying. Heard she's making wild claims about hidden gold on Henson land. The other man scoffed. Sounds like nonsense to me. But you know how some folks get when there's talk of gold. Jed's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm, finishing his purchases without drawing attention. As he rode back up to the line shack, his mind raced with the implications of what he'd heard. The sun was setting by the time Jed returned, casting long shadows across the small clearing. He gave the agreed-upon knock, and Pearl quickly unbolted the door, relief evident on her face. As they unpacked the supplies, Jed recounted what he'd overheard in town. Pearl's eyes widened in disbelief. Hidden gold? She exclaimed. That's ridiculous. I never said anything about gold. Jed nodded grimly. I reckon someone's trying to discredit your claim before you can even make it. Make it sound like you're just chasing fairy tales. Pearl sank onto a rough-hewn chair, her face troubled. What are we going to do? Jed sat across from her, his expression determined. We need proof, Pearl. Something official that shows your mama's claim to that land was real. Pearl was quiet for a moment, then suddenly stood up. Wait, she said, crossing to where her few belongings were stored. She pulled out a battered Bible, its leather cover worn smooth with age. This was my mama's, she explained, carefully opening it. From between the delicate pages, Pearl extracted several folded papers. I never thought much about these before, she said, handing them to Jed. But maybe they could help? By the flickering light of the oil lamp, Jed carefully unfolded the letters. His eyes widened as he read, then read again to be sure. Pearl, he said slowly, these are letters from the town's church elder. He's promising your mama he'll safeguard her title to the land. Jed looked up, a spark of hope in his eyes. This could be the proof we need. Pearl leaned forward, her heart pounding. Really? Jed nodded, but his expression remained cautious. It's not official documentation, mind you, but it's a start. We'd need someone with real authority to verify it. Like who? Pearl asked. The territorial judge, Jed replied. He rides circuit twice a year, settling disputes and handling official business. If we can get these letters in front of him, it might be enough to start a proper investigation. Pearl's eyes shone with a mixture of hope and determination. When does the judge come through next? Jed furrowed his brow, thinking. Should be within the month, if I remember right. We'll need to be careful, though. Can't risk showing our hand too soon. As the night deepened around the small cabin, Jed and Pearl pored over the letters, discussing their next moves. The discovery of these documents had shifted the ground beneath their feet, offering a glimmer of hope where before there had been only uncertainty. Outside, a light snow began to fall, dusting the trees and the cabin roof. Inside, warmed by the fire and a renewed sense of purpose, Jed and Pearl continued their planning, neither fully aware of the challenges that still lay ahead. Jedediah Cross sat at his rough-hewn table, studying a worn map of the territory. His finger traced the route from his remote cabin down to Willow Fork. Pearl Johnson watched him intently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Judge Everett should be in town within the week, Jed explained, his voice low and steady. We'll need to time our arrival just right. Pearl nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and apprehension. How long will it take us to get there? Jed stroked his beard thoughtfully. We'll take it slow, give you time to prepare. 2 days down to my cabin, then another to reach town. That should put us there right when we need to be. As they packed their meager supplies, Jed could see the tension in Pearl's shoulders. He paused, placing a gentle hand on her arm. Remember, Pearl, no matter what happens, you hold your head high. You've got as much right to be there as anyone. Pearl straightened, drawing strength from his words. Yes, sir. I'll remember. The journey down from the line shack was arduous but uneventful. Jed used the time to school Pearl in how to carry herself with dignity. As they made their way along narrow trails and through dense forests, he shared stories of people he'd known who'd faced adversity with grace. It's not about pretending the stairs don't hurt, he explained as they paused to rest the horses. It's about knowing your own worth, no matter what others might think. Pearl listened intently, soaking up every word. By the time they reached Jed's cabin on the second evening, she walked with a new sense of purpose, her chin held high despite her fatigue. They spent that night at Jed's cabin resting and preparing for the final leg of their journey. As Pearl settled into her bedroll near the hearth, Jed checked his rifle one last time before turning in. The weight of what lay ahead hung heavy in the air, but neither spoke of it, each lost in their own thoughts. Dawn broke clear and crisp the next morning. Jed and Pearl set out early, their horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as they made their way toward Willow Fork. The familiar landscape rolled by, scrub-covered hills giving way to more settled farmland as they neared the town. About midday, they stopped at a small creek to water the horses. As Pearl cupped her hands to drink, Jed kept a watchful eye on their surroundings. The sound of approaching riders made them both tense, but it was just a pair of ranch hands who nodded politely as they passed. See? Jed said softly. You've as much right to be here as anyone. Pearl nodded, squaring her shoulders as they remounted. She sat tall in the saddle, wrapped in Jed's spare coat against the autumn chill. As they drew closer to Willow Fork, curious glances turned their way. Some folks did double takes at the sight of Pearl riding alongside Jed, her head held high despite the whispers that followed them. Jed noticed how she kept her gaze steady, just as they'd practiced, and felt a surge of pride. They made their way to the small building that served as the town's courthouse when the circuit judge was in residence. Judge Everett Hale stood on the porch, deep in conversation with the town sheriff. At the sound of approaching horses, he looked up, his weathered face breaking into a broad smile as he recognized Jed. Well, I'll be, Everett called out, descending the steps. If it isn't Jedediah Cross, it's been too long, old friend. Jed dismounted, clasping the judge's hand warmly. Good to see you, Everett. You're looking well. Can't complain, Everett replied, his keen eyes moving to Pearl, who had also dismounted and stood quietly beside her horse. And who might this young lady be? Jed turned, gesturing for Pearl to step forward. This is Miss Pearl Johnson. We've come to see you on a matter of some importance." Understanding flashed in Everett's eyes. He'd known Jed long enough to recognize when his old comrade was involved in something serious. "I see," he said, his tone turning more formal. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside." Once seated in the judge's temporary office, Pearl found her voice. With Jed's encouraging nod, she began to tell her story. She spoke of her mother's land, of the missing title, and of the recent events that had brought her to this point. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, more confident. Judge Everett listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. When Pearl finished, he turned to Jed. "You believe her claim is legitimate?" Jed nodded solemnly. "I do. And we have something that might help prove it." He motioned to Pearl, who carefully withdrew the folded letters from her mother's Bible. Everett examined the letters, his expression growing more serious as he read. After what seemed an eternity, he looked up. "These letters from the church elder. They're not official documentation, but they do lend credence to Miss Johnson's claim." Pearl leaned forward, hope shining in her eyes. "Does that mean you'll help us, Judge?" Everett stroked his chin thoughtfully. "It means I'm willing to hear the case. We'll need to gather more evidence, hear from witnesses. But yes, I believe this warrants a proper hearing." The relief that washed over Pearl was palpable. Jed squeezed her shoulder gently, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "When can we have the hearing?" Jed asked. Everett consulted a ledger on his desk. "I can schedule it for 3 days from now. That should give us time to notify all interested parties and gather any additional evidence." As they prepared to leave, Everett pulled Jed aside. "You understand what you're getting into, old friend? This could stir up a hornet's nest." Jed's jaw set in determination. "I do, but it's the right thing to do, Everett. You know that as well as I do." The judge nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Just be careful, both of you." As they rode back to Jed's cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Pearl was quiet, processing all that had happened. "You did well in there," Jed said softly. "Spoke your piece with grace and strength." Pearl looked at him, a small smile on her face. "Thank you, Mr. Cross, for everything." Jed nodded, his expression serious. "We're not out of the woods yet. Until the hearing, I want you to stay close to the cabin. We can't risk anything happening to you or those letters." Pearl agreed, understanding the gravity of their situation. As they approached the cabin, the reality of what lay ahead settled over them both. The judge had agreed to hear their case, marking a turning point in their quest for justice, but they both knew that the real challenge was yet to come. That night, as Pearl settled into her bedroll, she clutched her mother's Bible close to her chest. Outside, Jed sat on the porch, his rifle across his lap, keeping watch over the young woman who had come to mean so much to him, and the hope for justice that now rested in their hands. The morning of the hearing dawned bright but cold, a thin layer of frost coating the grass and leaves. Jed and Pearl rose early, their breath visible in the crisp air as they prepared for the day ahead. Jed checked his Colt revolver, ensuring it was clean and loaded while Pearl stood before the small mirror in Jed's cabin, straightening her collar and smoothing her skirt. "You ready?" Jed asked softly as they stepped out onto the porch. Pearl nodded, her eyes steely with determination. "As I'll ever be, Mr. Cross." They mounted their horses and set off towards Willow Fork, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on hard-packed earth the only sound breaking the morning stillness. As they rode, Jed couldn't help but notice how Pearl sat tall in her saddle, chin lifted and gaze fixed ahead. She might not carry a weapon like he did, but her quiet resolve was a force all its own. The sun climbed higher as they approached town, casting long shadows across the main street. Folks stopped in their tracks as Jed and Pearl rode past, conversations dying mid-sentence. Some stared openly, while others averted their eyes, suddenly finding the dirt at their feet fascinating. They dismounted in front of the small courthouse, tying their horses to the hitching post. Pearl paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before ascending the wooden steps. Jed placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Remember," he murmured, "you've got every right to be here." Inside, the courthouse was already buzzing with activity. Judge Everett Hale sat behind his desk, his weathered face creased in concentration as he pored over documents. The Hensons occupied the front row of seats, Thomas looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best, while his wife Margaret fanned herself nervously. In the back row, Clay slouched, arms crossed, and a scowl etched deeply on his face. As Jed and Pearl entered, a hush fell over the room. Judge Everett looked up, nodding in acknowledgement. "Mr. Cross, Miss Johnson, please have a seat." They settled into chairs near the front, acutely aware of the eyes boring into their backs. Judge Everett cleared his throat, his voice carrying easily in the now silent room. "We're here today to examine evidence pertaining to a land dispute," he began, holding up the letters Pearl had provided. "These documents, while not official land titles, suggest that Miss Pearl Johnson may have a legitimate claim to a portion of land currently held by the Henson family." A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. Clay's scowl deepened, if that were possible. Judge Everett continued, his tone brooking no argument. "I've reviewed these letters, and I find them compelling enough to warrant further investigation. Therefore, I'm setting a date for formal testimony 2 weeks from today." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "I want to make something very clear. Any attempts to interfere with this process, to intimidate witnesses, or to tamper with evidence will be met with the full force of the law. Is that understood?" A chorus of mumbled assents filled the air. Pearl sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, justice would prevail. As the crowd began to disperse, Jed leaned in close. "You did good, Pearl. Real good." She managed a small smile, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Cross. I couldn't have done this without you." They exited the courthouse, blinking in the bright sunlight. Pearl's stomach growled audibly, reminding her that neither of them had eaten since dawn. "How about we get some food?" Jed suggested, nodding towards the small cafe across the street. Pearl hesitated, eyeing the townsfolk who still lingered nearby, some openly staring. But then she squared her shoulders and nodded. "Yes, I think that's a fine idea." The bell above the cafe door jingled as they entered, and once again conversation ground to a halt. The waitress behind the counter, a plump woman named Martha, looked from Jed to Pearl and back again, her eyes wide. "Table for two?" she asked, her voice unnaturally high. Jed nodded, and they followed her to a corner table. As they settled into their seats, the low hum of conversation slowly resumed, though it was noticeably more subdued than before. They ordered coffee and eggs for Jed, biscuits and gravy for Pearl, and ate in companionable silence. Pearl couldn't help but notice how the other patrons would steal glances at them when they thought she wasn't looking. It made her skin prickle, but she focused on her food, determined not to let their curiosity, or was it judgment, get to her. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, Jed and Pearl mounted up for the ride back to the cabin. The events of the day had left them both mentally exhausted, and they were looking forward to a quiet evening. The first sign that something was amiss came as they approached the cabin. Even from a distance, Jed could see that the front door was slightly ajar. He held up a hand, signaling Pearl to stop. "Stay here," he said quietly, dismounting and drawing his Colt. Pearl watched, heart pounding, as Jed cautiously approached the cabin. He pushed the door open with the barrel of his gun, then disappeared inside. After what felt like an eternity, he emerged, holstering his weapon. "It's clear," he called, "but you'd better come see this." Pearl slid from her saddle, legs slightly wobbly as she walked towards the cabin. As she drew closer, she saw what had caught Jed's attention, boot prints in the soft earth of the yard, leading to and from the door. Inside, nothing seemed obviously amiss at first glance. The furniture was undisturbed, Jed's few possessions still in their places. But as Pearl's gaze swept the room, a cold dread settled in her stomach. "The Bible," she whispered, rushing to the small table where she'd left her mother's cherished book. "It's gone." Jed's face darkened as the implications set in. The Bible, with its precious cargo of letters, their only tangible evidence to support Pearl's claim, had vanished. Pearl sank onto the edge of the bed, her earlier hope crumbling to dust. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small and lost. Jed knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "We don't give up," he said firmly. "Whoever took that Bible, they're scared. They know we've got a real chance here. We'll find another way, Pearl. I promise you that." As night fell outside the cabin, Pearl nodded, trying to draw strength from Jed's words. But the theft of the Bible and letters had shattered their moment of hope, leaving them both wondering what new challenges the coming days would bring. Jed's fist clenched as the reality of their situation sank in. The Bible, their precious evidence, was gone. He muttered a curse under his breath, careful not to let Pearl hear. She sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped, looking more defeated than he'd ever seen her. "I'm going into town," Jed announced, his voice gruff with determination. "There might be a trail we can follow." Pearl's head snapped up, worry etched across her face. "But it's nearly dark. Is it safe?" Jed managed a reassuring smile. "Don't you fret. I know these parts like the back of my hand. You stay here with Old Blue. He'll keep you safe." As if on cue, Jed's hound lumbered over, resting his grizzled muzzle on Pearl's knee. She absently scratched behind his ears, drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. Jed saddled his horse quickly, the familiar motions helping to calm his racing thoughts. He paused at the door, looking back at Pearl. "Bolt the door behind me. I'll be back by dawn." The night air was crisp as Jed rode towards Willow Fork. The moon, just past full, cast enough light to navigate by. As he approached the outskirts of town, Jed slowed his mount, eyes scanning the shadows. Near the saloon, a figure leaned against a hitching post, nursing a bottle. Jed dismounted, recognizing the man as Tom Watkins, a local ne'er-do-well known for having loose lips after a few drinks. "Evening, Tom," Jed said quietly, stepping close. "Seen anything interesting tonight?" Tom squinted at him, then shrugged. "Might have. What's it worth to you?" Jed pulled out a silver dollar, letting it catch the moonlight. Tom's eyes widened, and he nodded eagerly. "Saw two of Clay Henson's buddies earlier," Tom whispered conspiratorially. "Riding hard, carrying some kind of bundle. Headed towards the river they was." Jed's heart sank, but he kept his face impassive. "Which way along the river?" Tom pointed downstream. Towards the old ford, looked like. Jed tossed him the coin and remounted, spurring his horse towards the river. The sound of rushing water soon filled his ears as he reached the bank. Dismounting, he lit a small lantern and began to search, his boots sinking into the soft mud. For what felt like hours, Jed combed the riverbank, his hope dwindling with each step. Just as he was about to give up, a glint caught his eye. He crouched down, holding the lantern close. There, half buried in the mud, were scraps of charred paper. Jed's throat tightened as he gently lifted a piece. Though mostly blackened, he could just make out a fragment of handwriting, the same elegant script he'd seen in Pearl's mother's letters. "Damn them," he muttered, anger and despair warring in his chest. He gathered what scraps he could, knowing it was futile. The evidence was destroyed beyond recovery. As the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Jed rode back to his cabin. He was bone-weary, clothes caked with dried mud, but the heaviness in his heart weighed more than any physical exhaustion. Pearl was awake when he entered, pacing the small room. She rushed to him, hope in her eyes quickly fading as she took in his appearance and grim expression. "It's gone, isn't it?" she asked softly. Jed nodded, sinking into a chair. "I found what was left by the river. They burned it, Pearl. I'm so sorry." Pearl's face crumpled and she turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. "This is all my fault," she whispered. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your door, Mr. Cross. Maybe I should just leave. Go somewhere far away where Clay and his family can't hurt anyone else because of me." Jed stood, gently turning Pearl to face him. "Now you listen here," he said firmly. "This fight ain't just yours anymore. It's mine, too. Those Hensons, they crossed a line when they stole from my home and destroyed evidence. We're in this together now, you hear?" Pearl looked up at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. After a moment, she nodded, a tiny spark of determination rekindling. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jed ran a hand through his hair, thinking hard. We need to rest first. Then we plan our next move. They both slept fitfully for a few hours, exhaustion finally overcoming worry. When they woke, the sun was high in the sky. Jed made a simple meal of beans and cornbread, and they ate in contemplative silence. As Pearl washed the dishes, Jed paced the small cabin, his mind working furiously. We need a new angle, he mused aloud. Without those letters, we need someone who knew your mama, someone who can testify about the land. Pearl paused, a plate still in her hands. My Aunt Bessie might know someone. She raised me after Mama died, but she doesn't like to talk about the past much. Jed nodded slowly. It's a start. Anyone else your mama might have confided in? A friend, maybe? Or someone from the church? Pearl's brow furrowed in concentration. There was an old man. I remember him coming to visit sometimes when I was little. He and Mama would talk for hours. I think his name was Mr. Abernathy. Abernathy, Jed repeated, the name tickling something in his memory. Wait a minute. There's an Abernathy who runs the newspaper over in Copper Creek. Bit of a firebrand, always writing about injustice and such. A spark of hope lit Pearl's eyes. That could be him. Mama always said he had a way with words. Jed grabbed his hat, energy surging through him. All right then. First thing tomorrow, we ride for Copper Creek. If this Abernathy knew your mama, he might be just the witness we need. As they prepared for bed that night, the mood in the cabin had shifted. The loss of the Bible and letters still stung, but a new determination had taken root. They had a plan, a direction to move in. Jed checked the locks one last time before settling onto his bedroll. Get some rest, Pearl, he said softly. Tomorrow, we start fighting back. Pearl nodded, pulling the blanket up to her chin. As she drifted off to sleep, she held tight to the hope that somewhere out there, a living witness might hold the key to her rightful claim. With Jed by her side, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Jedediah Cross stood at the cabin door, watching the first hints of dawn break over the eastern horizon. His weathered face was etched with determination as he turned to Pearl, who was fastening the last strap on their pack mule. You ready? He asked softly. Pearl nodded, her eyes bright with a mix of hope and apprehension. As I'll ever be, Mr. Cross. Jed's mind wandered as they set out, the rhythmic clopping of hooves a steady backdrop to his thoughts. He recalled a face from years past, a Crow woman with intelligent eyes and a quiet strength about her. Mary Little Elk, that was her name. She'd come to trade furs for supplies, her words as precise as her measurements. Pearl, Jed said suddenly, breaking the morning silence. Your mama ever mentioned someone named Mary? Worked at the agency school, if I recall right? Pearl's brow furrowed in concentration. You know, I think she did. Said there was a Mary who kept records for the school. Why do you ask? Jed's lips curved into a small smile. I believe we might have ourselves an ally. Mary Little Elk, she's a school teacher on the reservation. Traded with her a time or two. If anyone's got records that could help us, it'd be her. A spark of hope flickered in Pearl's eyes. You think she'd help us? Only one way to find out, Jed replied. It's a 2-day ride north, but if we push hard, we might make it before the snow gets too deep. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the landscape slowly changing around them. The familiar hills gave way to more rugged terrain, and a biting wind picked up, carrying the promise of winter. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon. Jed eyed them warily. Looks like we're in for some weather. We'll need to find a good spot to camp tonight. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature dropped steadily. When they came to the first creek crossing, a thin layer of ice had already formed along the banks. Pearl shivered as her horse splashed through the frigid water. You all right? Jed called back, concern evident in his voice. Pearl nodded, pulling her coat tighter. Just cold, I'll be fine. As the sun began to set, Jed spotted a stand of cottonwoods near the creek. We'll make camp there, he said, pointing. Those trees'll give us some shelter from the wind. They worked together to set up camp, Jed showing Pearl how to build a fire that would last through the night. As they sat huddled near the flames, eating a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Jed grew quiet, his eyes distant. "Mr. Cross?" Pearl asked softly. "You all right?" Jed blinked, coming back to the present. "Just thinking," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Been a long time since I've camped like this with anyone." Pearl waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. After a long moment, Jed spoke again. "My Sarah, she loved nights like this. Said the stars seemed brighter out here, away from everything." He paused, swallowing hard. "We'd talk for hours making plans for the future. Never thought I'd be out here alone." Pearl's heart ached for the loneliness she heard in his voice. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cross. How long has it been?" "Going on 15 years now," Jed replied softly. "Fever took her and our little one before he even drew his first breath." Pearl reached out, placing her hand gently on Jed's arm. No words seemed adequate, but she hoped he could feel her understanding. They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and the distant cry of a coyote the only sounds. Finally, Jed cleared his throat. "We should turn in. Got another long day ahead of us tomorrow." As Pearl settled into her bedroll, she found herself seeing Jed in a new light. The gruff exterior hid a deep well of pain and loneliness. She silently vowed to do whatever she could to repay his kindness. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They broke camp quickly, both eager to reach their destination. As they rode, the landscape became more familiar to Jed, and he pointed out landmarks to Pearl. "See that butte over there?" he said, gesturing to a distinctive flat-topped hill. "That means we're getting close to the reservation boundary." Pearl nodded, taking in the rugged beauty around them. Despite the circumstances that had brought her here, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the vast, open country. As the sun climbed higher, Jed's posture changed, becoming more alert. "We're close now," he said. "Should be seeing the agency building soon." Sure enough, within the hour, a cluster of wooden structures came into view. Jed led them towards a modest building set slightly apart from the others. A simple sign identified it as the agency school. As they dismounted, the door opened and a woman stepped out. She was in her 30s with long, dark hair braided neatly down her back. Her eyes widened in surprise as she recognized Jed. "Mr. Cross?" she said, her voice warm but questioning. "This is unexpected." Jed tipped his hat respectfully. "Miss Little Elk, it's been a while. We were hoping we might have a word with you." Mary's gaze shifted to Pearl, curiosity evident in her expression. "Of course. Please come inside where it's warm." As they entered the schoolroom, Pearl couldn't help but marvel at the neat rows of desks and the colorful drawings pinned to the walls. It was a far cry from the rough cabin she'd been calling home. Mary gestured for them to sit at a table near the wood stove. "Now," she said, her tone businesslike but not unkind. "What brings you all the way out here, Mr. Cross?" Jed glanced at Pearl, giving her an encouraging nod. Pearl took a deep breath and began to explain her situation. Her mother's land, the missing documents, and the Hensons' attempts to keep her from claiming what was rightfully hers. Mary listened intently, her brow furrowing as Pearl spoke. When the girl finished, Mary leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "I remember your mother," she said softly. "She was a kind woman, always eager to learn about our ways." Mary paused, considering her next words carefully. "I kept detailed records of all the families who interacted with the agency. It's possible I might have something that could help your case." Hope surged in Pearl's chest. "Really? Oh, Miss Little Elk, that would mean everything." Mary held up a hand, tempering their excitement. "I can't promise anything, but I'll look through my files. It might take some time." Jed nodded, understanding the delicacy of the situation. "We appreciate any help you can give us, Miss Little Elk. We know it's asking a lot." Mary's eyes softened as she looked at Pearl. "It's no trouble. Your mother was always good to our people. It's only right we try to help her daughter." As Mary stood to fetch some tea, Pearl felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to truly hope. With Jed's steadfast support, and now Mary's potential evidence, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead in reclaiming her mother's legacy. Mary Little Elk listened intently as Pearl recounted her story, her dark eyes filled with compassion. The schoolhouse was quiet save for the crackling of the wood stove and Pearl's soft voice. Jed stood nearby, his weathered hands resting on the back of a chair, a silent pillar of support. As Pearl finished speaking, Mary nodded slowly. "I remember your mother well," she said, her voice warm with memory. "She was always eager to learn about our ways, and she treated our people with respect." Pearl's eyes brightened at this. "Did you know her well?" Mary smiled gently. "Well enough to know she was a good woman who loved you very much." She paused, her expression turning thoughtful. "And I believe I might have something that could help you." With that, Mary rose from her chair and moved to a corner of the schoolroom. Pearl and Jed watched curiously as she knelt down and carefully pried up a loose floorboard. From the hidden space beneath, she withdrew a battered tin box. "I keep the most important documents here," Mary explained as she returned to the table. "Safe from prying eyes and the elements." With careful hands, she opened the box and began sifting through the folded papers inside. Pearl leaned forward, her heart racing with hope. After a moment, Mary's fingers stilled, and she withdrew a yellowed document. "Here," she said, her voice quiet but triumphant. "This is what we're looking for." Pearl's breath caught as Mary unfolded the paper. It was an older deed to the land, the ink faded but still legible. What caught her eye, however, was the official seal at the bottom, a federal treaty recognition. This deed, Mary explained, was recorded under federal treaty. It's a stronger claim than most local papers. Jed leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the document. "Will the town honor this?" he asked, his voice gruff with concern. Mary's expression turned serious. "They may not want to," she admitted. "Without the force of law behind it, some might try to dispute its validity. But it's far stronger than the letters you lost. It gives you a real chance." Pearl felt a mix of emotions surge through her: hope, fear, determination. "What do we do now?" she asked, looking between Jed and Mary. Mary folded the deed carefully and handed it to Pearl. "I'll ride back with you," she said firmly. "I can present this at the hearing and speak to its authenticity. My position at the agency gives me some authority in these matters." Relief washed over Pearl. Having Mary's support felt like a turning point. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the deed to her chest. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Mary's smile was kind. "Your mother was always good to our people. It's only right that we help her daughter now." As night fell, they decided to rest at the schoolhouse before setting out at dawn. Mary offered Pearl and Jed blankets and pillows, making up simple beds near the stove. The warmth of the fire and the safety of Mary's presence allowed Pearl to relax for the first time in days. Unable to sleep, Pearl found herself drawn to Mary's desk, where lesson plans and children's drawings were neatly arranged. Mary, noticing her interest, invited Pearl to help prepare materials for the next day's lessons. "I'll be gone for a few days," Mary explained, "so I want to leave plenty for my students to work on." Pearl eagerly agreed, finding comfort in the simple task of organizing papers and sharpening pencils. As they worked, Mary shared stories of her students and the challenges of teaching on the reservation. Pearl listened intently, her admiration for the dedicated teacher growing with each word. "You must love your work," Pearl observed as they finished preparing the last of the lessons. Mary nodded, her eyes bright. "It's not always easy, but helping these children learn and grow, it's the most rewarding thing I've ever done." As they settled in for the night, Pearl felt a new sense of purpose. Mary's dedication to her students inspired her, reminding her that there was more to life than just surviving. She fell asleep dreaming of what she might do with her mother's land if she could reclaim it. Before the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, the schoolhouse stirred with activity. Jed, Pearl, and Mary moved quietly but efficiently, gathering their belongings and preparing for the journey ahead. The air was crisp and carried the unmistakable scent of approaching snow. "We'll need to move quickly," Jed said as they stepped outside. "That storm's not far off." Mary nodded in agreement as she secured her saddlebags. "If we push hard, we should reach Willow Fork by Saturday morning. The whole town will be gathering for service. It's the perfect time to make our case." As they mounted their horses, Pearl couldn't help but feel a surge of nervous energy. The weight of the deed, safely tucked inside her coat, seemed to press against her heart. This piece of paper, hidden away for years, now held the key to her future. The three riders set out just as the first rays of sunlight began to paint the sky. Pearl found herself between Jed and Mary, drawing strength from their steady presence. The landscape rolled by, the familiar hills and valleys taking on a new significance now that she understood the true value of the land. As they rode, Mary shared more about the history of the area, pointing out landmarks and explaining their significance to the Crow people. Pearl listened intently, realizing how little she truly knew about the land she was fighting to claim. "Your mother understood the importance of respecting the land and its history," Mary said at one point. "She always said that owning land was about stewardship, not just possession." These words struck a chord in Pearl, and she found herself pondering what it truly meant to be a steward of the land. The responsibility felt enormous, but also deeply right. As the day wore on, the sky grew heavier with the promise of snow. The wind picked up, carrying a biting chill that cut through their layers of clothing. Despite the discomfort, they pressed on, each of them acutely aware of the importance of reaching Willow Fork before the storm hit in earnest. They stopped only briefly to rest the horses and eat a quick meal of jerky and hardtack. As they remounted, Jed cast a wary eye at the darkening sky. "We'll need to find shelter soon," he said. "Can't risk getting caught out in the open when that snow starts." Mary nodded in agreement. "There's an old line shack about an hour's ride from here. It's not much, but it'll keep us out of the worst of it." With renewed urgency, they spurred their horses onward. The first flakes of snow began to fall as the sun dipped low on the horizon, and by the time they reached the line shack, a steady curtain of white was obscuring the landscape. The shack was indeed small and weathered, but it offered a welcome respite from the biting wind. As Jed tended to the horses, Mary and Pearl worked to get a fire going in the small stove. Soon the interior was filled with warmth and the comforting smell of wood smoke. As they huddled around the stove, sharing a meager supper of beans and coffee, Pearl felt a strange mix of emotions. The enormity of what lay ahead in Willow Fork weighed heavily on her mind, but here, in this moment, she felt oddly at peace. "Thank you both," she said softly, looking between Jed and Mary. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." Jed's weathered face softened into a rare smile. "You're tougher than you give yourself credit for, girl, but you're not alone in this fight." Mary reached out and squeezed Pearl's hand. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become. We'll see justice done, come what may." As the wind howled outside and snow piled up against the walls of the shack, Pearl allowed herself to hope. With the treaty-recognized deed safely in her possession, and these two steadfast allies by her side, she felt ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in Willow Fork. Tomorrow would bring them to the town, to the Saturday service where the whole community would be gathered. It would be their chance to present the truth, to reclaim what was rightfully hers. As Pearl drifted off to sleep, lulled by the crackling fire and the soft breathing of her companions, she dreamed of her mother's land, and of the future she might build there. The snow began to fall in earnest as the sun climbed to its zenith, the flakes growing larger and more numerous with each passing hour. What had started as a light dusting soon became a thick blanket of white, obscuring the trail and slowing their progress to a crawl. Jed pulled his horse alongside Pearl's, his brow furrowed with concern. "We need to find shelter soon," he called over the rising wind. "This storm's only going to get worse." Mary nodded in agreement, her eyes scanning the landscape. "There's a rock overhang about a mile ahead," she said, pointing to a distant outcropping. "It's not much, but it'll keep us dry." They pressed on, the horses plodding through the deepening snow. Pearl huddled deeper into her coat, grateful for its warmth, but acutely aware of how ill-prepared they were for this sudden turn in the weather. The deed, safely tucked against her chest, felt like a talisman against the cold. By the time they reached the overhang, the world had become a swirling mass of white. The rock face loomed before them, a dark sentinel against the storm. They dismounted quickly, leading the horses into the relative shelter of the overhang. Jed wasted no time in getting a fire started, his experienced hands coaxing flames from damp wood. Soon, the small space was filled with warmth and the comforting aroma of coffee brewing. As they huddled around the fire sharing mugs of steaming coffee and pieces of cornbread, Mary's eyes took on a distant look. "Your mother was a remarkable woman, Pearl," she said softly. "Did you know she fought for education rights for both Black and Native children?" Pearl shook her head, her eyes wide with surprise. "I knew she cared about education, But I didn't know she fought for it like that. Mary nodded, a sad smile playing at her lips. Oh, she did. And she made enemies doing it too. Some folks didn't take kindly to the idea of all children having equal opportunities. As Mary recounted tales of Pearl's mother's bravery and determination, Pearl felt a swell of pride mixed with a deep ache of loss. She had known her mother was special, but hearing about her fights for justice made Pearl realize just how much she had missed out on. She sounds like she was quite a woman, Jed said, his gruff voice softened with respect. She was, Mary agreed. And I see a lot of her in you, Pearl. You've got that same fire in your eyes. Pearl ducked her head, both pleased and overwhelmed by the comparison. As the storm raged outside their small shelter, she found comfort in these stories of her mother's strength and courage. They passed the night huddled close to the fire, taking turns keeping watch and tending to the horses. By morning, the snowfall had eased, though a thick blanket of white covered the landscape as far as the eye could see. We need to press on, Jed said as they broke camp. The going will be slow, but we can't afford to lose any more time. They set out, the horses picking their way carefully through the deep snow. The world seemed muffled, the usual sounds of nature dampened by the thick layer of white. Pearl found herself lost in thought, her mother's legacy weighing heavily on her mind. As the afternoon sun struggled to break through the clouds, a distant sound caught their attention. The rhythmic thud of hoofbeats grew louder, and soon a rider appeared on the horizon, moving swiftly towards them. Jed's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but Mary held up a hand. "Wait," she said, squinting into the distance. "I think... Yes, it's Judge Everett." Sure enough, as the rider drew closer, they could make out the familiar figure of the judge. But he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a small contingent of soldiers, their blue uniforms stark against the white landscape. Judge Everett reined in his horse as he reached them, his face grave beneath his snow-dusted hat. "Jed, Pearl, Mary," he greeted them. "I'm glad I found you." "What's happened, Everett?" Jed asked, eyeing the soldiers warily. The judge's mouth set in a grim line. "There have been threats on my life," he explained. "The Army's providing protection until we can sort this mess out." Pearl felt her heart sink. The situation in Willow Fork was clearly more volatile than they had realized. "We can't delay the hearing," Mary said firmly. "Pearl's claim needs to be heard." Judge Everett nodded. "I agree. That's why I've decided to hold the hearing immediately after Sunday service. The whole town will be there. Maximum witnesses. Maximum protection." Jed let out a low whistle. "That's a bold move, Everett." "These are bold times," the judge replied. "Now let's find a place to camp for the night. We've got a lot to discuss before we reach town." They rode together until they reached a frozen creek, the ice glinting in the fading light. The soldiers efficiently set up a perimeter while Jed and the others made camp. As night fell, they gathered around the fire, sharing a meal of beans and salt pork. The soldiers kept a vigilant watch, their presence a constant reminder of the danger they faced. Pearl found herself sitting next to Judge Everett, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. "I'm sorry for all the trouble this has caused," she said softly. The judge turned to her, his eyes kind but determined. "Don't apologize for seeking justice, Pearl. Your mother's land was stolen, plain and simple. It's high time that wrong was put right." His words bolstered her resolve, reminding her of why they had undertaken this journey in the first place. As she looked around the camp, at Jed's steady presence, Mary's quiet strength, and the judge's unwavering commitment to the law, Pearl felt a surge of hope. The night passed slowly, the silence broken only by the occasional crack of a branch in the fire, or the soft murmur of the soldiers changing watch. Pearl slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of her mother and the land that should have been hers. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the snow-covered landscape, Pearl awoke with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Today they would reach Willow Fork. Today, she would face those who had sought to deny her birthright. But as she looked at her companions, Jed saddling the horses, Mary packing up their meager supplies, Judge Everett conferring with the soldiers, she knew she wasn't alone. Whatever challenges lay ahead in Willow Fork, she would face them with these steadfast allies by her side. The small party set out as the sun climbed higher in the sky, their horses leaving a trail of hoof prints in the pristine snow. Pearl rode tall in her saddle, the deed secure against her heart, ready to claim what was rightfully hers. The Sunday morning sun crept over the horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. As the first rays touched the steeple of Willow Fork's small church, the bell began to toll, its clear notes ringing out across the quiet town. Into this tranquil scene rode an unusual procession. Jedediah Cross led the way, his weathered face set in grim determination. Behind him, Pearl Johnson and Mary Little Elk rode side by side, an unlikely pair united by a common purpose. Judge Everett brought up the rear, flanked by his army escort, their blue uniforms a stark contrast against the white snow. As they made their way down the main street, townsfolk began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. They crowded onto the boardwalks, bundled against the morning chill, their eyes wide with curiosity and apprehension. "It's that Johnson girl," one woman whispered to her neighbor. "And isn't that the Crow school teacher with her?" "What's the judge doing here?" another man muttered, his brow furrowed with concern. The whispers grew as the group dismounted in front of the church. Pearl stood tall, her chin held high despite the weight of so many stares. Jed placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they climbed the steps. Inside, the church was already filling with the usual Sunday crowd. Pastor Green stood at the pulpit, his sermon notes clutched in one hand as he watched the newcomers file in. The congregation shifted in their seats, an undercurrent of tension rippling through the room. As Pearl and her companions took seats near the front, she couldn't help but notice the Hensons sitting across the aisle. Thomas Henson's face was a mask of forced calm, but his son Clay looked ready to bolt, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Pastor Green cleared his throat, attempting to bring order to the suddenly restless congregation. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "let us turn our hearts and minds to the Word of God." But before he could continue, Mary Little Elk rose from her seat. A hush fell over the church as she made her way to the front, a rolled document clutched in her hand. "Forgive me, Pastor," Mary said, her voice clear and steady. "But there is a matter of justice that must be addressed before this congregation." Pastor Green hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining order and allowing Mary to speak. After a moment, he nodded, stepping aside to give her the floor. Mary unrolled the document, holding it up for all to see. "This," she announced, "is a treaty deed, recognized by the federal government. It contains a clause that directly pertains to the land currently held by the Henson family." A murmur rippled through the church. Thomas Henson leaned forward, his face pale, while Clay gripped the edge of the pew so hard his knuckles turned white. Mary began to read, her voice carrying to every corner of the small church. "By the terms of this treaty, the land known as Willow Creek Ranch, measuring 320 acres, is hereby granted in perpetuity to Sarah Johnson and her heirs." The congregation shifted uncomfortably, whispers breaking out here and there. Mary continued, her voice rising above the growing noise. "This land, wrongfully taken from Sarah Johnson upon her death, rightfully belongs to her daughter, Pearl Johnson." As Mary finished speaking, all eyes turned to Pearl. She sat straight-backed, her gaze fixed ahead, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Judge Everett stood then, his presence commanding immediate attention. "As an officer of the territorial court," he said, his voice steady and authoritative, "I can confirm the legitimacy of this document. The treaty deed presented by Miss Little Elk is genuine and legally binding." The murmurs in the church grew louder. Thomas Henson's face had gone from pale to ashen, while Clay looked as though he might be sick. "Furthermore," Judge Everett continued, "I am entering this matter into official record today. The land known as Willow Creek Ranch will be returned to its rightful owner, Pearl Johnson, effective immediately." A collective gasp went up from the congregation. Some people looked shocked, others angry, and a few nodded in grim satisfaction. Pastor Green, who had been standing to the side during this pronouncement, stepped forward once more. "Friends," he said, his voice shaky but growing stronger, "we have witnessed a great injustice being corrected here today. Let us remember the teachings of our Lord, who tells us to love our neighbors and to right the wrongs we see in this world. As the pastor spoke, Pearl felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She looked around the church, meeting the eyes of those who had once shunned her. Some looked away, shame-faced, while others offered tentative smiles of support. Jed leaned in close, his voice low. "You did it, Pearl. Your mama would be proud." Pearl nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thought of her mother, of the fights she had fought, and the legacy she had left behind. For the first time in a long while, Pearl felt truly connected to her past and hopeful for her future. As the congregation began to stir, discussing the shocking turn of events in hushed tones, Judge Everett made his way over to the Hensons. "Mr. Henson," he said firmly, "I expect you to cooperate fully in the transfer of the property. Any resistance will be met with the full force of the law." Thomas Henson nodded stiffly, his face a mix of anger and resignation. Clay, however, jumped to his feet. "This ain't right," he shouted, his voice cracking. "That land's been ours for years." "Sit down, boy," his father hissed, pulling Clay back onto the pew. As the Hensons argued in hushed, heated tones, Mary approached Pearl. "Your mother kept careful records," she said softly. "She knew this day might come, and she wanted to make sure you had what you needed to claim your birthright." Pearl took Mary's hand, squeezing it gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As the church slowly emptied, people filing out into the crisp morning air, Pearl remained seated. She closed her eyes, offering up a silent prayer of thanks for the unexpected allies who had helped her on this journey. When she finally stood, Jed was waiting for her at the end of the pew. "Ready to go see your land?" he asked, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Pearl nodded, a sense of purpose filling her chest. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm ready." Together they walked out of the church and into the bright sunlight, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The town of Willow Fork would never be the same, and neither would Pearl Johnson. Judge Everett strode purposefully toward the small courthouse, his boots crunching on the fresh snow. 2 soldiers flanked him, their blue uniforms a stark contrast against the white landscape. The judge's face was set with determination as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Townsfolk had crowded into the cramped space, their breath visible in the chilly air. At the center of the room stood a large, leather-bound book atop a sturdy oak desk, the official record of property ownership for Willow Fork. Pearl Johnson stood near the front, her back straight and her chin held high. Jedediah Cross stood close behind her, his weathered face a mixture of pride and concern. Across the room, Thomas Henson and his son Clay huddled together, their expressions a blend of anger and resignation. Judge Everett made his way to the record book, the crowd parting before him like water. He picked up a quill pen, dipped it in ink, and began to write in a steady hand. The scratching of the nib against paper was the only sound in the otherwise silent room. "I, Judge Everett Hale, do hereby enter into official record the transfer of ownership of the land known as Willow Creek Ranch, measuring 320 acres, to Pearl Johnson, rightful heir of Sarah Johnson," he read aloud as he wrote. The judge's voice carried clearly through the courthouse. Some of the townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded in approval. Pearl stood stock still, her eyes fixed on the judge's hand as he recorded her claim. As Judge Everett finished writing, he looked up and scanned the room. "Are there any who wish to contest this ruling?" he asked, his tone making it clear that such a challenge would be unwise. For a moment no one moved. Then, slowly, Thomas Henson stepped forward. He removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair, and held it against his chest. His face was etched with lines of shame and regret as he approached Pearl. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology. I've known for years that there was something not right about how we came by that land, but I chose to ignore it." He swallowed hard before continuing. "What was done to your mother and to you was wrong. I'm here to make it right." Pearl's eyes widened in surprise, but she remained silent, waiting for Thomas to finish. Thomas turned to Judge Everett. "I'm prepared to sign over the disputed tract formally," he said. "It's the least I can do to start making amends." As Thomas moved to take the quill from the judge, Clay suddenly burst forward. "Pa, you can't!" he shouted, his face red with anger. That land's been ours for years. We can't just give it away. Thomas whirled on his son, his expression thunderous. Quiet, boy, he snapped. You've done enough harm already. This land was never rightfully ours, and it's high time we owned up to that fact. Clay's mouth snapped shut, his face a mixture of shock and resentment. He retreated to the back of the room, glaring at Pearl from a distance. With a steady hand, Thomas signed his name below the judge's entry, officially relinquishing his claim to the land. He then turned back to Pearl, holding out the quill to her. It's yours now, Miss Johnson, he said softly, as it always should have been. Pearl stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly as she took the quill. She dipped it in the inkwell, and with careful strokes, signed her name beneath Thomas's. As she finished, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the courthouse. Judge Everett nodded solemnly. It is done, he declared. Let all present bear witness to this transfer of land, done in accordance with the law and in the interest of justice. The judge then carefully removed the page from the record book and handed it to Pearl. This is your official document of ownership, Miss Johnson, he said. Guard it well. Pearl's fingers closed around the paper, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She clutched it to her chest, feeling the weight of its significance. As the crowd began to murmur and shift, Judge Everett motioned to the soldiers. I believe it's time we took our leave, he said quietly. Best not to give tempers a chance to flare. The small group made their way to the courthouse door. As Pearl stepped out into the bright winter sunlight, she blinked, momentarily dazzled. The townsfolk who had not been inside the courthouse were gathered on the street, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Jedediah moved to Pearl's side, resting a calloused hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, seeing the pride shining in his eyes. You did it, Pearl, he said softly. Your mama would be mighty proud. Pearl nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She held the document tightly, feeling as though her whole world had shifted on its axis. The soldiers flanked Judge Everett as he mounted his horse. We'll escort the judge out of town, one of them announced, to ensure there's no trouble. As the small procession moved down the main street, the townsfolk watched in silence. Some looked away, shame evident on their faces. Others nodded respectfully to Pearl as she passed. Pearl stood tall, her head held high as she watched the judge and his escort disappear down the road. She knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one filled with challenges and opportunities she had never dreamed possible. As the weeks passed, the once empty ranch house slowly came to life. Pearl and Merry Little Elk settled into a comfortable routine, their friendship deepening as they worked side by side. The old wooden structure, weathered by years of neglect, began to feel like home under their care. Jedediah Cross, true to his word, spent his days helping to repair the dilapidated fences that encircled the property. His strong hands worked tirelessly, mending broken posts and stretching new wire. In the barn, he cleared away years of debris, making room for the animals they would soon acquire. Pearl, determined to make the ranch a success, decided to hire help. She remembered the struggle of those often overlooked in Willow Fork and made a bold choice. 2 widows from town, Mrs. Abernathy and Mrs. Tanner, were brought on to help with household duties and tending to the chickens. Their weathered faces lit up with gratitude at the opportunity for honest work. For the heavier labor, Pearl hired 3 young native men from Mary's community. John Tallpine, Robert Two Rivers, and Samuel Whitehawk arrived with quiet determination, eager to prove themselves. Their knowledge of the land and its rhythms proved invaluable as winter approached. The decision to hire such a diverse group drew mixed reactions from the townsfolk of Willow Fork. Some, like Pastor Green, praised Pearl's compassion and forward thinking. Others muttered darkly about the dangers of mixing races and upsetting the natural order. Pearl held her head high through it all, knowing in her heart that she was doing right by those who needed a chance. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the ranch became a haven of warmth and light. Lamps burned late into the evening, their glow spilling from windows onto the snow-covered ground outside. Inside, the air was filled with the murmur of conversation, punctuated by occasional laughter. One particularly cold evening, as wind howled outside, the inhabitants of the ranch gathered for supper. Pearl had prepared a hearty stew, its rich aroma filling the kitchen. Jedediah sat at the head of the table, his weathered face softened by the lamplight. Mary was to his right, while Mrs. Abernathy and Mrs. Tanner sat opposite. The three young men had been invited in from the bunkhouse, a gesture that touched them deeply. As they passed around thick slices of cornbread, Pearl found herself overcome with emotion. She looked around the table at these people who had become more than employees. They were family. Her gaze settled on Jedediah, the man who had risked everything to help her when she was at her lowest. "Jed," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet room, "I want to thank you. For everything." She paused, gathering her courage. You've been the father I never had." The room fell silent. Jedediah looked up, his eyes meeting Pearl's. For a moment he seemed at a loss for words. Then, slowly, he nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm honored, Pearl," he said gruffly. "Truly honored." The simple exchange spoke volumes. In that moment, Pearl felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. She had not only gained a home but a chosen family, one bound not by blood, but by shared struggles and mutual respect. As the meal continued, the conversation flowed easily. Plans were made for spring planting, fences that still needed mending, and a possible trip to town for supplies. Outside, the winter wind continued to blow, but inside the ranch house all was warm and bright, a beacon of hope in the harsh frontier landscape. As the snow melted and the first green shoots peeked through the thawing earth, Pearl Johnson's ranch began to flourish in more ways than one. The harsh winter had given way to a season of growth and change, not just for the land but for the people of Willow Fork as well. Word spread quickly through the town and surrounding homesteads about the fair wages and safe lodging offered at Pearl's ranch. Those who had once turned their backs on her, mocking her dreams and belittling her worth, now found themselves reconsidering their stance. The ranch's reputation for honest work and respectful treatment drew the attention of laborers and traders alike. One crisp morning, Pearl stood at the fence line where months ago she had endured her greatest humiliation. The wooden posts still bore faint traces of the cruel words that had once marred their surface. But today, Pearl held a paintbrush in her hand, determination shining in her eyes. With slow, deliberate strokes, she covered the lingering shadows of hatred with fresh, bright paint. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the fence transformed. Where once there had been pain and shame, now stood a message of hope and inclusivity. In bold letters that seemed to glow in the spring light, Pearl painted, "All are welcome." Mary Little Elk, working nearby in the vegetable garden, paused to watch. She smiled, seeing the power of this simple act. "You're rewriting history, Pearl," she called out, "making something beautiful from the ashes." Pearl stepped back, admiring her handiwork. "It's what Mama would have wanted," she replied softly. "A place where folks can come as they are and find respect." As the weeks passed, the fence became a symbol of the ranch's philosophy. Travelers on the road would often stop to read the message, some even taking the time to introduce themselves to Pearl and her growing family of workers. Every Sunday, like clockwork, Jedediah Cross would ride up the lane to the ranch house. His visits became a cherished ritual for Pearl and the others. He always arrived with small gifts tucked into his saddlebags, a jar of wild honey gathered from a hidden hive in the hills, a wooden spoon lovingly carved during long evenings by the fire. These simple presents meant the world to Pearl. Each one represented not just Jed's skill or generosity, but the fatherly love that had grown between them. She displayed every gift proudly in the ranch house, a testament to the family she had found. The change in attitude extended beyond the ranch's borders. When Pearl and her workers attended Sunday services in town, they noticed a shift in the congregation's behavior. Where once there had been turned backs and whispered judgments, now more heads nodded in greeting. Some even offered shy smiles or a quick word of welcome. Pastor Green, true to his initial support, made a point of including Pearl and her diverse group of workers in church activities. This public acceptance went a long way in softening the hearts of even the most stubborn townsfolk. The Henson family, including Clay, kept their distance. The shame of their actions and the loss of the land seemed to weigh heavily on them. While they made no moves toward reconciliation, the open hostility had faded. The trouble that had once seemed never-ending had quieted, allowing Pearl and her people to focus on building their future rather than defending against threats. As spring blossomed into early summer, the ranch stood as a testament to Pearl's vision and perseverance. The once neglected buildings now bustled with activity. Fields that had lain fallow for years were carefully tended, promising a bountiful harvest. But more than the physical transformation, it was the spirit of the place that truly shone. The ranch had become a beacon of hope, a living example of what could be achieved when people came together in mutual respect and hard work. The fence that had once been a symbol of cruelty now stood as a public declaration of welcome and dignity, a promise made in paint and lived out every day by Pearl and those she had gathered around her. The warm spring afternoon bathed the ranch in golden light, casting long shadows across the newly greened pastures. Pearl Johnson, Mary Little Elk, and Jedediah Cross sat contentedly on the wide porch of the ranch house, their eyes fixed on the playful antics of newborn calves in the nearby field. The gentle lowing of cattle and the occasional snort from the horses in the corral created a soothing symphony of ranch life. Pearl leaned back in her rocking chair, a contented smile playing on her lips. The past months had been a whirlwind of change, hard work, and healing. Now, in this moment of quiet companionship, she felt a deep sense of peace settling over her like a warm blanket. Mary's eyes sparkled with excitement as she gazed out over the land. "You know," she said, her voice full of possibility, "I've been thinking about planting an orchard on that south-facing slope." She pointed to a gentle rise just beyond the barn. "The soil there is rich, and with proper care we could have apples, pears, and maybe even some plums in a few years." Pearl nodded, easily visualizing Mary's plan. "That'd be a fine addition," she agreed. "Imagine how good it'll smell come blossom time, and the fruit would be a welcome treat for everyone working here." Jed chuckled, a sound that still surprised Pearl with its warmth. "An orchard, eh?" he mused, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Well, if you're going to be putting down roots like that, I reckon I might have to think about doing the same." Pearl and Mary exchanged curious glances. "What do you mean, Jed?" Pearl asked, leaning forward in her chair. The old trapper's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Oh, I was just thinking I might build myself a cabin a bit closer to town. These old bones don't take to long rides like they used to, and it'd be nice to be nearer to, well, to folks." Pearl's heart swelled at the implication. Jed had become more than just her protector and ally. He was family now, the father figure she'd never had. The thought of him being closer, of being able to see him more often, filled her with joy. "That'd be real nice, Jed," she said softly, reaching out to pat his weathered hand. "You know you're always welcome here, but having you closer would be a blessing for sure." A comfortable silence fell over the trio as they continued to watch the calves frolic in the late afternoon sun. The ranch spread out before them, a testament to hard work, perseverance, and the power of community. Fields that had once lain fallow now promised a bountiful harvest. The barn and outbuildings, once dilapidated, stood strong and purposeful. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink, Pearl found herself lost in reflection. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm almost grateful for that awful day when Clay and his friends—" She trailed off, the memory still painful despite the time that had passed. Jed and Mary listened attentively, giving her the space to find her words. Pearl took a deep breath and continued. "As cruel as it was, that day became the beginning of my new life. If it hadn't happened, I might never have met you, Jed. Or you, Mary. I wouldn't have this ranch or this family we've built." Mary reached out and squeezed Pearl's hand. "The Creator works in mysterious ways," she said sagely. "Sometimes, what seems like our darkest moment is just the first step on a brighter path." Jed nodded in agreement. "You've come a long way, Pearl," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Your mama would be mighty proud of the woman you've become and the good you're doing here." As the last rays of sunlight painted the land in a warm glow, Jed stood up with a grunt. "Well, I reckon it's about time I headed back," he said, stretching his back. "Got some trap lines to check before it gets too dark." Pearl and Mary rose as well, following Jed down the porch steps to where his horse stood patiently tied. As Jed checked the cinch and adjusted his saddlebags, Pearl felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Without warning, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the old trapper in a tight hug. Jed stiffened for a moment, unused to such displays of affection, but then relaxed, patting Pearl's back awkwardly, but with genuine warmth. "Thank you," Pearl whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Jed cleared his throat, clearly moved. "Aw, now," he said gruffly. "No need for thanks. You're family, Pearl. That's what family does." As Jed mounted his horse, Pearl and Mary stood side by side, watching him settle into the saddle. With a final tip of his hat, Jed turned his mount and rode off toward the mountains, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. Pearl and Mary remained on the path, watching until Jed disappeared from view. As they turned back toward the ranch house, the sounds of the evening surrounded them. The clatter of dishes from the bunkhouse kitchen, muted laughter from the workers enjoying their supper, the soft nickering of horses being settled for the night. All of it blended into a comforting hum of life and purpose. Looking around, Pearl felt a sense of awe at what they had accomplished. This land, once a source of pain and conflict, now stood as living proof that dignity, love, and hard-won justice could indeed take root and flourish, even in the stoniest of grounds. As they climbed the porch steps, Mary paused, her hand on the door handle. "You know, Pearl," she said thoughtfully, "what you've built here, it's more than just a ranch. It's a beacon of hope for folks who've been told they don't belong. You've created a place where people can come and find respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." Pearl nodded, feeling the weight of Mary's words. "That's all I ever wanted," she replied softly. "A place where everyone is welcome, where we can all work together and build something good." With one last look at the peaceful evening settling over the ranch, Pearl followed Mary inside. The warm glow of lantern light spilled out onto the porch, a beacon of welcome in the gathering dusk. Behind the closed door, the sounds of quiet conversation and shared laughter drifted out into the night, a promise of companionship, of family found rather than born, and of a future built on the foundations of compassion and understanding. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.